Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be reading more scary stories from the True Scary Story Reddit. This is a warning ahead of the video that some of these stories may be a little graphic, so if you're young or not okay with some gruesome details, I would suggest to click off the video. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this way longer video. Night Crazies. At 19, I was hired for the role of a correctional officer, one of the youngest there at the time, working at the most dangerous prison in Australia. I'd worked there for 40 years, 7 days a fortnight, 12-hour shifts. While it sounded like a pretty laid-back role, easy money really, the toll it takes on the mind is unimaginable, to the point where no money could encourage me to redo my time working there. There was good times where the men I worked with would better themselves and make something out of their lives afterwards. But I saw all manners of things, from courtyard fights to public masturbation to murder and suicide. But none of that was what stuck with me through my time there. You would think so, but no. The one thing that stuck with me through my time there was a short-lived and supernatural experience. There was not a single drop of blood spilled during this experience, yet it was one of the most horrific and graphic things I have ever witnessed. It was a night shift, come in at 7 p.m., finish at 7 a.m. We very rarely did night shifts, and this was my first time since finishing training. What usually was a staff of 200 people had dwindled down to about 30 by 10 p.m. We weren't left alone per se, but we generally did rounds on our own every hour or so. I was prepared and ready to take on the night, and being the youngest on the team and presumably the most naive, there was rounds of light-hearted teasing directed towards me. You'll have aged to 60 by the end of the night. Be aware of the night crazies, young Padawan. The start of the shift was quiet, peaceful almost. No issues, no weird bumps in the night. The inmates were quiet, dead asleep in their cells. It was probably around 4 in the morning. The tiredness were really starting to sink in when I saw the figure shift out of the corner of my eye, just outside the unit. At this point, I had just brushed it off as being sleep-deprived and left it to myself while the other staff members did their rounds. However, when I saw the figure move back to where it first initially moved from, my alarm bells started going off. Quietly at this point. I turned in my chair to face the window that looked out into the graveyard and focused my eyes on where I saw the figure move to. Attempting to peer through the darkness, I saw it. Just a shadow. But there was something there. Now, usually if we saw something strange, we should radio it in case it was a loose inmate. But this wasn't a human figure, so I put it down to maybe being an animal, which, as large as it was incredibly unlikely. This was a max security prison. Nothing larger than a rat should be getting in. It took my tired brain longer than it should have to process this information. The alarm bells that just moments before were a simple quiet whisper of, "Something may be wrong," were now blaring. My now fatigued mind and body were awake, every nerve burning, ready to take action. I leaned over to the control panel and flipped on the outside lights. Nothing. Nothing was there. Just me and my embarrassingly labored breathing filling the unit. My radio crackled. My supervisor had seen the lights flipped on from the unit she was currently doing rounds in. I had told her I thought I seen something moving outside, but it was most likely just my eyes playing tricks on me. She had laughed back and said something that caused my skin to break out in the chilled sweat. "We said to be careful of the night crazies. This is a lonely time and the crazies are lively tonight." Really? It's a sentence that doesn't entirely make sense, unless crazies was a description word of someone or the name of something. I brushed it off as her and the team trying to spook the literal new kid on the block, but still something lingered inside of me that told me that something was not right. I had half an hour of tainted peace before the next encounter with the shadow, except this time it wasn't outside. It started as a simple, quiet tapping. Maybe it was the wind, but it's coming from the inside. Well, then maybe it was one of the inmates awake and bored. During the day, the inmates would cause a muck. if they were confined to their cells, from tapping to banging to blood-curdling screams. The thing was, after a few minutes of thought, it was coming from one of the unoccupied cells. I was still alone at this point, but my unit partner should have arrived back soon after finishing their rounds. I'd stared at the cell door for a few minutes, trying to determine what to do, when the tapping suddenly stopped. My previously furrowed brow softened into a picture of surprise, but mostly relief. Almost immediately after relaxing, the scraping started. A long, painful sound, like someone was drawing their nails across a blackboard. I cringed at the sound initially, but then panic took over. It wasn't a loud and deafening sound, but it was there. It was happening when it shouldn't have been. I racked my brain on what to do. Radio in. Strange noise coming from unoccupied cell. Going to investigate. My unit partner gave their affirmations and reported they would only be a few more minutes. That's it, probably nothing, and that I didn't need to wait for them to check in on the cell. I wish they had asked me to wait. I stood and walked over to the cell, in a daze, not even a single hesitation. The outward confidence was at war with my insides, my heart pounding, my brain screaming for me to stop, and my lungs burning for air. My stomach was tied up in knots, and even with all these warnings that something was terribly, terribly wrong behind that door, I didn't stop myself from reaching for the latch. I opened the door. I hadn't turned on the cell light. They all turn on at the same time, and I didn't want to wake the inmates. The only light poured in from the central unit, my shape blocking most of it, letting a few dim streams through. I stepped in. I don't know why. We aren't allowed to step into a cell before inspecting it, but I did it anyways. I stepped inside into the corner to let more light in, and I saw it. It was facing away from me, a crouched humanoid figure. Its skin was sickly green, gray color. Its knees bent backwards. The kneecaps facing towards me. Its limbs were long and skinny. Its joints, large bulbs protruding from underneath its skin. It didn't even acknowledge me. It just raised its long arms up above its head, placing the tips of its grotesque digits against the concrete wall of the cell, and ever so slowly dragging its fingers down. It had been silent until this point. The fingers were halfway down its path when I let out a small gasp. It paused, just for a second. Then it started to stand, its perverted knees cracking as it did. I was frozen. Its head was sat on a dangerously long neck that was almost the length of its demented body. It had to stoop so that its head wouldn't hit the roof. Then it started to turn. But just before I saw its face, the room went black. The door had shut and I crumbled to the floor, screaming for what felt like hours, but was really only 30 seconds, according to my unit partner, who had run to open the cell door. I was sent home early that day. I expected to hear something about it when I went back into work, but there was nothing. Not even lighthearted teasing. It was like nothing had ever happened. A few months after the event, when I had finally settled back into a normal routine, I did some research on the prison. Many old Australian jails had wretched pasts filled with torture. This particular jail was notorious for it back in the day: abuse, torture, hangings, and riots. I wish I had not researched this history of the jail I worked at, because up until the point I had convinced myself that I was simply sleep deprived, although that doesn't explain the cell door closing shut and locking. For the most part, the research brought up nothing too daunting, just the typical graphic and gruesome history of Aussie jails. However, I unearthed a diary entry that was written by a man from the dark times, and one of his last entries really put the nail in the coffin for me. It stayed burned in my mind for these last 40 years. This is what his entry said. The walls we tap to make song are the same walls we scratch. Our nights are loops, and our hunger destroyed our truce. They break our legs, and for daylight we beg. Instead, they stretch out our necks with their noose. Me too. This happened when I was in middle school, when I was around 13 or 14 years old in the early 90s. I used to play PC games on my uncle's old 386 PC. My uncle, who was my dad's brother, used to live in my grandparents' house. It was a fairly large house since my dad had 5 siblings, along with my grandparents, and they had different rooms. The PC was in a large living room, and the hallway leading to the bedrooms was on the right. At that time, only 3 people were living there: my uncle and both my grandparents, since my other uncles and aunts already moved out. Now, my uncle's an introvert and mostly just stays in his room, coming out to get some coffee, then going back in. The same thing for my parents. So most of the time, it was like an empty house. I lived in a house just near it. Anyway, I used to play for hours on end on that PC in the living room. Sometimes my uncle would stand near me watching me play, asking stuff about the game, but pretty much I was mostly alone. But it didn't really bother me until one night. Around 7 to 8 p.m., I was playing on the PC. The lights were off as usual, and I felt my uncle standing behind me. I then talked about the items I had on my character, the dungeons, etc., but he wasn't talking. I really didn't care, so I just went on talking about my game. Around 5 minutes later, the light in the hallway turned on, and out came my uncle carrying his cup to get some coffee. I was stunned. If he was there, then who was behind me? I slowly turned my head and saw that I was wearing something gray. I immediately got up and ran out the door, not bothering to turn off the PC. I even heard my uncle say something, but I couldn't understand whatever it was he said, as I was really scared. I told my mom about it, but she just laughed at me. The next morning, I went back to the house and saw my uncle making some coffee. He scolded me for leaving the PC on, then asked me why I suddenly ran out. I just kept silent that time. Then I asked him if there was a ghost in the house because I thought I saw one last night. He just laughed at me and said, "Of course not, they're not real. There's no ghost wearing gray in the house." I was surprised because I didn't tell him I was wearing gray. So I told him about that. Then he put his cup down, a bit stunned, and then whispered to me, "That's why I stay in my room. I see it too." The stupidest true scary story. Okay, so this is very true. Very stupid, but I have no way of explaining it. Last night, my 7-year-old was in the shower. He screamed for help, but not like a scared help, more of a "Dad, I need help" kind of scream. I go to the bathroom and he points at the shower floor and points to 2 brown lumps on the floor of the shower and says, "Daddy, I think that's poop." I look down in disbelief. Sure enough, it appears as though 2 mystery turds landed in the shower floor. Like any Hardy Boy or Nancy Drew, I immediately went into detective mode and went to the obvious conclusion, "Boy, you shit in my shower." However, he swears, "No, Daddy, I just looked down and it was there." I, of course, don't believe him. He's the one in the shower. There is now shit in the shower. He shit in the shower. Doesn't take Enola Holmes to figure out, but he swears up and down he didn't do it. This is where, for me, it's rough because at 7 years old, my son has never really told me a lie. That was an opinion based. And this is a lie he is sticking to. He's crying now because I don't believe him. I'm crying because he has lied to me for the first time, and that means we're moving into a new part of our life. Eventually, we'll all calm down, and I just go about the night assuming he should. And he went about his night upset because I don't believe him. I mean, what else could it be? So now, an hour later, he is lying on my wife's lap, and I'm on the other side of the room, sitting under a ceiling fan, painting. As I sit there, painting, focused on painting a tiny miniature, suddenly, what I could only guess was 2 cups of water splashing straight down on my head. I'm startled. My family jumps at me, jumping, and I'm now very wet. There are no water pipes in my ceiling, and I am under a fan that was very dry and dusty. So now we have in one night mystery poop and mystery water. Where I was in disbelief in my son and I accused him of lying, I have to accept that possibly he was telling the truth. If water could seemingly materialize on my head, then maybe a poop could materialize in the shower. What spook or specter could be so devious? Seconds from unknown danger. It was back in high school after prom during my senior year. Being the young and energetic teenagers we were, we of course decided to go to one of the big prom after parties. After a quick change of clothes, we headed to the bonfire party, where we each enjoyed our fair share of debauchery. Lots of alcohol was drunk and lots of weed was smoked. As the party died down and I was beginning to feel fatigued from the long night, I asked my buddy to give me a lift home. He drives me home, we say our goodbyes, and I watch him pull back down the driveway. Remembering my mom had said she left the back door unlocked for me, I head to the back porch, where I took a quick piss and smoked a cigarette. While there, I contemplated my high school years and the fun times I had. I flicked the remainder of my cigarette and headed inside, looking for the door behind me immediately. Seconds later, I dropped my phone and wallet on the bar when all of a sudden the door behind me began to rumble loudly. The doorknob was twisting and turning violently, and the door was shaking nonstop. I froze, paralyzed in fear and not fully understanding what was happening. I stood there and simply kept watching the door as the rumbling just kept going, as if someone was trying to break in. It seemed to go on forever. When it finally stopped, I called my mom into the room, turned on the back porch light, and peeked through the blinds. I saw nothing but heard the barks of our dogs. My mother called her boyfriend, and he came over to inspect around the house, finding nothing out of the ordinary. This is a scary moment of my life, not knowing what would have happened if I didn't lock the door immediately, or if it even happened at all and I simply drank and smoked too much. The only thing I know was real was the intense fear that left me hopelessly motionless. Doll in the Woods and the Redhead Girl. So, this is the first of many creeper stories that my roommate and I experienced our freshman year of college. For context, me and my best friend Pat met in high school and roomed together in college. They say don't live with your friends, but we had a lot in common and got along super well. There was no issue there. We were city kids, but we went to college out in the sticks. The campus was secluded from the highway and was surrounded by woods. Our freshman year, we shared a typical cinder block dorm room, two single beds, two desks, two dressers, and a closet with no doors, which had a cutout on the top for storage containers. There was enough space for someone to climb up and sit up there if they wanted to, and we often did. One night, as usual, we stayed up late bullshitting for hours. We talked school, dream jobs, girls we liked, what we thought about God, etc., etc., etc. Pat suddenly changed his tone. He told me that he was having these reoccurring dreams that were freaking him out. In the dream, he was walking in the woods and came across a porcelain doll that, for whatever reason, was very unnerving to him. Every time he went to pick it up, he would suddenly wake up in a panic, like you do when you dream that you're falling. I could see it was bothering him, but didn't think anything of it. I told him he was probably thinking too much into it and it would likely pass in time. This was my opinion on the matter until a few days later, I started having the same dream. One night, we had the dream at the same time and we both woke up screaming. This happened on Thursday night, and we decided that since the next day was Friday and we both had a light schedule, we would take our bikes on a ride in the forest near our campus. So Friday comes and we just do that. Class ends, we get lunch at the cafeteria, and then we hop on our bikes and ride the trail that leads to the woods. Since Pat is the most familiar with the dream, he leads the way, remarking the whole time how similar the dream is to the woods we were currently in. We rode for an hour and we both could feel the tension and the uncomfortable vibes increasing the deeper we went on the trail. Pat stopped suddenly and said, "This is it. This is where the doll is. Let's go right." We went maybe a fourth of a mile into the brush and we found it. It was a porcelain baby doll with a green dress and bonnet. It was an exact match to the dream we were both having. We felt the bad vibes intensify to the point where we were dripping in sweat, even though it was cool and overcast autumn day. The most unnerving thing was that the doll was in pristine condition, completely unaffected by the dirt and mud around it. The wind blew hard enough to cause our shirts to flare out and our bikes to rattle. The doll didn't move an inch. Quickly, we looked at each other and, without a word spoken, agreed it was time to leave. We hopped on our bikes and took off for campus. Neither of us could sleep that night, so we put on a movie and took some ZzzQuil. Eventually, we passed out. In the early morning hours, we both woke up and heard a girl giggling. We both had thought maybe the other snuck a girl in, but that wasn't the case. We heard a voice say, "Hey, up here," and looked up to the sturge cut out above the closet. A red-headed girl in a white dress and an indistinguishable face sat there expressionless. We just stared. In a passive voice, she said, "Why did you leave me there?" Neither of us could speak. I managed to mum out an unsure and quiet, "What?" "You heard me. I said, why did you leave me there?" In a flash, everything on the storage cutout fell to the floor and broke open. The noise was unnaturally loud, so loud that it woke our neighbors up next door, who were also good friends. They knocked on the door from the adjoining bathroom and entered the room. We had no way of explaining to them what happened. We thought that they'd think we were crazy, so we told them that we think the base of the cutout broke and dumped our stuff on the floor. They accepted the story, and we spent the remainder of the night cleaning the mess that the redhead girl left. We never went back in the woods. We never went looking for the doll. The dream kept occurring, but slowly fizzled away. To this day, as close of friends as we are, we do not talk about the doll in the woods and the redhead girl. This was a two-story home. It was supposedly over 100 years when I lived there in 1991. There was a stable in the backyard that was just as old as the house. It was huge. Off from the kitchen, there was a downstairs bathroom. It went largely unused. This was because there was actually 3 to 5 stairs you need to climb up before getting to the bathroom. But it wasn't the climbing that put us off. Directly to the right at the bottom of the stairs was another staircase leading down into the cellar. Of course, the door was kept closed, and I never ever went into the cellar. Only my stepfather did, but he entered from outside. I'm not even sure if it was a cellar to be exact. It wasn't underground, just below the bathroom, even though the bathroom was off from the kitchen and the kitchen was ground level. Actually, unsure on this because, like I said, I never went in. Because no matter how deep into the summer was in house without air conditioning, that bathroom stayed seriously cold and gave off forbidding feeling. The usual stuff happened here. Doors closing on their own, opening, lights coming on and going off, though some of the lights came on at full brightness even though it was set to a dimmer switch. One day, my mom was working and my stepfather took my 6-year-old brother there with him. That left me and my 10-year-old brother home. I picked up the phone to call a friend and got no dial tone. Instead, there was the signal that you'd get when there was a phone off the hook. Hang up and retry. Same deal. I left my bedroom and go to my mom's, something I was not supposed to do, but I did it anyways, so I could make sure her cordless was on the hook. Yup. So downstairs to the kitchen, same deal. Back to my room, confused and honestly very aggravated. Again, I try my phone. Now, this is different. Chopping noises. As if someone's using an axe to cut wood, and worse, there's a woman screaming in the background. She sounds terrified. I slam down the phone. Then after I cool off, I pick it up again and hear the same thing. So now I'm making my rounds through phones again, all of them replaying the same scene straight out of a horror movie. When I finally hang up the kitchen phone, my brother finally asks what's going on, and I tell him. He doesn't believe me. I hand him the phone and ask him what he hears. His face goes pale. He hears the same. I pick up the phone again and miraculously get a dial tone. Quickly, I dial my mom at work, and she gets on, hears my story, and says the phone lines are crossed or something. So I get off the phone from her and immediately call my friend. She listens to my story and laughs at me. She thinks I'm making it up. I tell her I'm serious and not making it up. Phone disconnects. I stare at it. It rings. I pick up. It's her. She tells me that wasn't funny. She thinks I hung up on her, and I tell her I didn't. Phone disconnects again. I get an idea. I tell my brother to go across the street and ask his friend's dad to call me. He does. A few minutes later, the phone rings. I pick up, chopping and screaming. I repeat hello several times. I give up and hang up. My brother comes back. He says his friend's dad heard me saying hello, and his line was clear. I'm done with the phone for the day. Anyone else have anything similar happen to them? Anyone have any ideas what the fuck this was?